Sometimes it's not the thunder that changes your life. It's the quiet sound of a wheel turning, a breath held, a cup tipping. Welcome, kind soul. Today's story isn't about grand gestures. It's about the quiet ways two people begin to matter to each other. If your heart has ever longed for connection in the middle of chaos, this story is for you. The city of Valeria stirred like a restless child. Its breath was loud car horns, shoe heels, hurried greetings, plans already running late. Somewhere between the crowd and the clamor, Clara rode her aging bicycle through a side street still half asleep. Her scarf flapped in the wind, the old metal frame groaned with each turn of the pedals. In the front basket, 2 paper cups of coffee trembled with every bump in the road. Clara didn't draw attention. That was part of how she survived. She moved like someone who had too much on her shoulders to ever move slowly. Her eyes were kind, but always searching, perhaps for time she never seemed to have. She worked mornings at a cafe few people could find unless they were lost on purpose. It was called the Hollow Tree, tucked behind ivy and silence. The smell of ground beans and warm bread wrapped around her every day like a second skin. But her real life was on the 4th floor of St. Avril's Hospital, where her younger brother Noah had been fighting an invisible war for as long as she could remember. He was 17 and tired. Every shift she took, every tip she pocketed, every early morning ride, it all led back to him. That quiet hospital room where the world paused and her love had no cure. Across the city, but really, in another world entirely, stood Damien Vale. He leaned against his snow-colored car, dressed in a suit as precise as the clocks that lined his office walls. The city seemed to bend around him. 30 years old, CEO of Vale Dominion, heir to a family that measured success in glass towers and silence. People called him brilliant, efficient, unshakable. But brilliance is cold when there's no warmth to reflect it. Damien's life was calculated contracts, acquisitions, legacy. And his grandfather never let him forget. The family ends with you unless you do something about it. But Damien had no interest in fairy tales. Not love, not marriage. Those were stories for people who had time to bleed. Clara was too focused on the coffee, the clock, the delivery slip crumpled in her coat. She didn't see him step into the crosswalk. The wheel jolted. Her balance shifted. The cups soared. And in a single, breathless second, everything unraveled. Hot liquid splashed across Damien's suit, dark and sudden, like rain on white marble. The rich scent of roasted coffee hung between them. Clara jumped off her bike, frozen in a mixture of dread and disbelief. A single crumpled napkin was all she had. I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the heartbeat pounding in her ears. I'll fix it. I'll pay. I'm so sorry. Then her eyes met his. And for the first time that day, neither of them was thinking about time or duty or destinations. They were simply there, in the mess, in the moment. 2 strangers, both carrying more than they could hold. And neither of them knew it was the beginning. The fabric of his suit was likely worth more than Clara made in an entire month, maybe 2. She stared at the spreading stain in disbelief, heart pounding, already bracing herself for the humiliation to come. Damien Vale lowered his gaze slowly to the mess on his chest, then back to the girl standing in front of him. No words, just a faint curl of his lips, less a smile than a warning. So, he said finally, voice cool and deliberate, is this your idea of getting my attention? Each word was like ice breaking across still water, sharp, sudden, final. Clara blinked, caught off guard not by his tone, but by the absurdity of it. I beg your pardon? she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her cheeks flushed hot. He narrowed his eyes. If this is some attempt to be noticed, I'd say it's a poor one. She straightened her back, though standing next to him made her feel child-sized and let her fear burn into something else. Get your attention? She shot back. Do you seriously think I have time to stage coffee accidents just to impress a man who clearly talks to himself in the mirror every morning? Her voice trembled slightly, embarrassment flickering beneath her sarcasm, but she didn't back down. People had started to glance their way, just enough to make her feel exposed. A young woman in a faded cafe apron, standing her ground against a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not on a sidewalk. Damien raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to being challenged. Doing your job, he said flatly. Then try doing it without making others pay for your clumsiness. He turned, already dismissing her from his world. But Clara wasn't done. Clumsiness, she called after him. Right, because a dry cleaning bill is such a tragedy. I just lost a customer because of this detour. Which one of us really suffered? That made him stop, just for a second. He turned his head, and for the first time, his expression broke its perfect line. Surprise crept in. Not big, but enough. No one usually dared to throw words back at Damien Vale. Something about her, how she managed to be both furious and flustered, messy and bold, lodged itself quietly in a corner of his mind. You'd do well to be more careful, he said. Then he slipped into his car and drove away, leaving Clara beside her dented bicycle and rising frustration. Later that evening, in the flickering yellow light of their small apartment, Clara recounted the scene to Noah. She laughed as she spoke, half in disbelief, half in lingering irritation. I swear, he looked at me like I was a stray dog trying to climb into his limo. Must be nice, floating above the world with pockets that deep. Noah chuckled, his smile faint but real. Lying in his hospital bed, eyes shadowed but shining, he lived for moments like this when Clara's voice pushed the heaviness away. She was his whole world, and he was the reason she kept waking up every morning, no matter how heavy the day before had been. Far above the city, behind the glass walls of his 50th floor office, Damien Vale stared at nothing in particular. The city lights glowed like distant stars. He had work to do, papers to sign, calls to return. But for some reason, the image of that girl, flustered and fierce, tugged at the edge of his thoughts. He told himself it was meaningless. Just noise, but something he didn't know what had shifted. The ballroom of the Celestine Grand Hotel shimmered under a sea of chandeliers, their crystals scattering light like stars caught in motion. The annual charity gala was in full bloom, a symphony of designer gowns, champagne flutes, and polite performances of generosity. Clara stood near the wall, invisible in a black dress borrowed from a friend. She gripped an empty tray like it might float her out of the room. She didn't belong here, not among the people whose watches cost more than her month's rent. But she wasn't here for the glitz. She was here for Noah. The hospital organizing the gala had welcomed volunteers, and Clara had seen an opening not just to serve canapes, but to get close to those whose donations could mean more medicine, another month, another breath for her brother. Every second she spent here, her hope was quiet, focused, desperate. Not far away, Damien Vale stood encircled by men in silk ties and women with practiced laughs. Cameras flickered like fireflies. His presence was expected, not because he cared, but because appearances mattered. He was unaware that the girl who had ruined his morning now stood only meters away. But fate, once it begins to stir, rarely stops after the first nudge. Damien Vale moved through the ballroom like he was made for it. The dark lines of his tailored suit sculpted his frame with military precision, each step silent yet commanding. His face gave nothing away, only cool calculation behind gray eyes that rarely softened. He didn't come here out of charity. He came because he was told to. In the seat of honor, near the front of the hall, his grandfather, Walter Vale, sat like a figure, carved from old stone. His silver hair was combed back immaculately, his cane polished like a warning. But it was his gaze unwavering, all-seeing that tracked Damien's every movement. A week earlier, over a stiff dinner, Walter had said the words Damien had heard too many times. "I don't have long left, boy. It's time you settle down. Find a respectable woman before I'm gone." To Damien, it felt like another business transaction, another demand to fulfill someone else's idea of what legacy should look like. He didn't believe in marriage. He barely believed in permanence at all. The gala was a parade of polite deception. Laughter echoed like rehearsed lines. Champagne was raised for causes few truly cared about. And then suddenly, the illusion cracked. A candle, left too close to the edge of a linen-covered table, tipped with the wind. Flame touched fabric, and flame never asks for permission. Within seconds, the corner of the grand hall was swallowed in smoke. Voices rose in panic, heels clattered against marble, and the crowd surged for the exits. Clara, who had just set down her tray of empty glasses, didn't hesitate. She tore off her jacket, dropped to her knees, and smothered the flames with swift, practiced movements. No drama, no hesitation, just instinct. People looked, some even clapped, but Clara wasn't interested in being seen. She only wanted the gala to continue. Every second it paused was a second stolen from the possibility of helping her brother. Not far away, Damien stood frozen for the first time in years. It was her, the girl with the fire in her voice, and the coffee stains on his memory. He watched, eyebrows drawn, but didn't have long to think, because in the scramble, something slipped from his hand. The ring. It wasn't just jewelry, it was family, history, weight. Damien bent to retrieve it, but the wave of guests pushed him back like a tide. Meanwhile, Clara, breathless and coughing, lowered herself to the floor near the smoldering table and caught a glint beneath the scorched cloth. She reached for it, a gold band, heavy and ornate, with an eagle etched into the center. It was clearly something precious. Without hesitation, she held it up, planning to return it. But before she could stand, a voice stopped her. "Young lady, what are you holding?" She turned to find herself face to face with an old man regal, proud, and far too focused. Walter Vale. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but something stranger. Amusement. He stepped closer, his cane clicking softly on the marble floor, and looked at the ring in her hand. Then, to Clara's confusion, he smiled. "The Vale family ring," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "So, this is how fate chooses." Clara blinked, unsure whether she was being accused or congratulated. Behind her, Damien had returned, pushing through the lingering crowd just in time to catch the tail end of his grandfather's words. Walter turned to him with a glint in his eye. "Damien, I didn't expect your engagement to be announced like this." The air thickened. Clara turned pale. Damien went still. "What?" "No, sir. I just found it. I was going to return." Clara tried to explain, but her voice was lost in the rising murmurs. Walter was already raising his cane. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "congratulations to my grandson and his fiancée. The family ring does not lie." A ripple of gasps, then applause, then flashing cameras. Clara stood paralyzed, the ring heavy in her trembling hand, 1,000 unspoken protests caught behind her tongue. And Damien, trapped under the full weight of expectation and pride, stepped forward, eyes locked on Clara's. There was no warmth in his gaze, only warning. She had accidentally stepped into a world where every misstep had consequences. And now, Neither of them could walk away. Damien turned back to the crowd, the weight of expectation pressing down like cold marble. His voice, though quiet, carried a sharp finality. "Very well," he said. "She's my fiancée." No warmth, no hesitation, just words, cold and deliberate, falling like stones into still water. Clara stood frozen. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, uncertain breaths. Her voice found her, but too late, too shaky. "No, I'm not," she whispered. "What are you saying?" But Damien didn't look at her. His gaze was a steel wall, unyielding, unreadable. He leaned in, close enough for his voice to cut through only to her. "Keep quiet. Unless you want to make this worse for yourself." The chill in his tone made her stomach twist. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her legs might as well have turned to stone. Walter Vale, pleased beyond reason, pulled them closer for the cameras. The click of the flashes felt like the snapping of unseen threads around her. Then Walter, full of ceremony and satisfaction, took her trembling hand, placed the family ring into Damien's palm, and said, "Put it on her. Tradition must be honored." Damien's jaw tightened, but in front of all these eyes, even he couldn't defy the old man. His fingers, stiff and distant, slid the heavy ring onto hers. It was cold, too cold, a piece of metal that now felt like a shackle. The applause erupted. Strangers smiled. A photographer captured the moment that didn't belong to her. She looked up at Damien, searching, hoping for something. A signal that this was just a mistake, a joke, anything. But he turned away, and what little light was in his eyes was gone. To Damien, she was an accident that kept spiraling. To Clara, he was the storm she hadn't seen coming. When the gala finally sputtered to an end, Santon, Damien pulled her aside into the shadows of the empty corridor. His voice dropped again. Colder now. "This isn't real. I said what I said to keep my grandfather quiet. That's all. Don't make the mistake of thinking it means anything." Clara, though shaking, lifted her chin. "Don't worry," she snapped. "I wouldn't want to be tied to someone like you, even for a second. But if you don't fix this, I will." He laughed a humorless, sharp sound. "Try," he said. "But don't say I didn't warn you." And just like that, a simple accident had turned into a cruel twist of fate, an engagement neither wanted. Forged not from love, but from pressure and pride. Clara had no idea then just how far the consequences of that ring would reach. 2 days later, the skies above Valeria wept. Rain whispered down the windows of the hollow tree, and inside, Clara wiped the last crumbs from a table, her arms aching from the long shift. The bell above the door jingled. She looked up, and her heart dropped. Damien stood in the doorway, the shoulders of his dark suit wet from the rain, his expression carved from frost. The last customer slipped out behind him, leaving the cafe quiet except for the steady sound of raindrops. "You," he said. His voice was calm, but something in it left no room for refusal. "We need to talk." Without waiting, he moved to the back corner, nodding for her to follow. Clara tossed the cleaning cloth aside and walked toward him with fire in her eyes. "I'll be direct," Damien began, hands in his pockets. "My grandfather expects us to marry immediately. And in return, I'll cover your brother's hospital expenses. Every single one." He said it like he was offering a business deal. But Clara recoiled as if slapped. "Marry you?" she echoed, her voice raw. "What, do you think you're some kind of reward? Some prize every girl dreams about?" He opened his mouth, but she didn't let him finish. "I'm not your puppet, and I won't let you and your grandfather pull strings with my life." Her voice cracked not from fear, but from fury. Damien's eyes narrowed, the storm rising behind them again. "Is that your final answer?" Damien's voice was low, but his presence filled the room like a storm cloud waiting to break. This is your only chance to save your brother. Clara stepped forward and jabbed a finger into his chest, her voice like fire under pressure. You think I can't survive without your money? Throw me to the street. I'll still walk it with my head held high. Don't you dare think I'd ever bow to you. And with that, she turned on her heel, leaving nothing but silence behind her. Damien didn't reply. He simply walked out into the rain, his tall frame swallowed by the gray blur beyond the cafe windows. Clara thought that was the end of it. But the next morning, at the hospital, her world began to crumble. The head physician pulled her aside into a quiet consultation room. His voice was somber. Heavy. Miss Dawson, he began gently. I'm afraid we have to postpone Noah's operation. The charitable sponsor behind the funding just pulled out. Without payment, we can't move forward. Clara stood there, frozen. What, but... Last week you said it was all confirmed. I'm truly sorry, he replied, looking away. It was a decision from above, out of our hands. Her thoughts spiraled, her chest tightened. She went home and made desperate calls to anyone she thought could help. But the doors that were open just days ago were now shut tight. That night, she sat by Noah's bedside, watching him sleep, his face pale, his breath shallow but peaceful. She brushed a hand over his hair, whispering into the quiet, I'll find a way. I always do. The next morning, as rain continued to paint the cafe windows in long silver lines, Damien walked back into the hollow tree. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable. Clara, her eyes red from sleeplessness, looked up and her heart filled with dread. What now? She snapped, the fury in her voice barely hiding her exhaustion. Damien reached into his coat and placed a document on the counter, one line stamped boldly at the top. Vale Corporation. Medical Fund Allocation. Your brother's surgery, he said, calm as stone, fully paid, if you agree to marry me. Clara grabbed the paper, scanning the details, and her blood ran cold. It was him. He had orchestrated it all. His company had been the mysterious sponsor. He was the reason the hospital had withdrawn support to corner her, to force her hand. You monster, she choked, tears now spilling freely. You'd use my brother's life to trap me? Damien didn't flinch. Say yes, and he lives. Say no, and the deal vanishes. Clara trembled. Her fist clenched. She wanted to hit him, scream, tear him apart, but all she could see in her mind was Noah, smiling through the pain, trusting her. She met Damien's eyes, voice shaking, but steel-edged. Fine. I'll marry you. But know this, I'll make you regret dragging me into this. He smirked, as if he welcomed the challenge. Good. The wedding is in 3 days. 3 days later, the grand ballroom of the Celestine Grand Hotel gleamed with chandeliers and silk. A live orchestra played sweeping symphonies for a crowd that measured beauty and money. Walter Vale stood at the center, glowing with triumph. The event was less a celebration of love and more a public declaration of control, legacy, power. Clara was dressed in a gown she hadn't chosen, an imported masterpiece of pearls and tulle, hugging her like a second skin. In the mirror, she didn't see a bride, just a girl wearing someone else's dream. I look like a princess, she whispered bitterly, but I feel like a prisoner. Damien, in a dark tailored suit, stood beside her at the altar, expression colder than stone. When he slid the family ring onto her finger, he didn't meet her eyes. The priest spoke. The guests applauded. Clara turned her face just enough to mask the tear threatening to fall. After the ceremony, Damien drove her to his estate, a glass and marble mansion, perched high above Valeria, overlooking the city lights like a silent king. Inside, everything was sleek, sterile, beautiful, and hollow. Your room is on the second floor, Damien said, not bothering to look at her. I'm rarely here. Do what you like. Just "Don't touch my things." Then he walked away, footsteps echoing in the house that didn't know laughter, and Clara stood there in her shimmering gown, ring heavy on her finger, heart heavier still. She had traded her freedom for a promise. And now, she belonged to a stranger made of ice. The foyer echoed with silence as Clara stepped inside, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder like a stubborn piece of her old life. The house was cold, cavernous, indifferent to her presence, but she wasn't here to break. She may have been trapped in a loveless arrangement, but she had no intention of surrendering to despair. Clara had weathered too many storms to wilt now. She was grit wrapped in sunshine, and she would find her own light right here, even in this frozen palace. On her first morning in the mansion, wandering through endless hallways and rooms that didn't seem to breathe, she stumbled upon something unexpected: a garden, forgotten and wild. And, nestled behind the house like a secret, the garden had been left to the mercy of time, overgrown hedges, stubborn weeds, wildflowers blooming without permission. Clara stood there, hands on her hips, a grin tugging at her lips. "Well," she said aloud, laughing softly, "guess I'm not the only thing in this place that got tossed aside, but still decided to grow." And so she adopted the garden. She pulled weeds, dug her fingers into the dirt, watered what she could. She pruned gently, patiently, humming under her breath as the late afternoon sun painted gold through the leaves. One evening, as shadows stretched across the grass, she sat among the wildflowers, singing an old lullaby her mother used to hum in the kitchen. Her voice was low, gentle, sincere. Unseen from an upstairs window, Damien Vale watched. He had returned earlier than expected, and the sight of her, barefoot in the earth, singing to no one but the sky, caught him off guard. Something shifted, just briefly. His chest tightened, but he dismissed it. Illusion, he told himself, nothing more. And he turned back into the shadows of his study. The days passed, and though the wall between them never cracked, Clara found her own rhythm. She claimed a small corner of the kitchen, just enough space for toast, soup, and whatever comfort she could summon. She sang softly while she cooked, old tunes mixed with made-up melodies. One night, Damien came home late. As he walked past the kitchen, he paused in the hallway, hearing her voice through the half-open door. She was singing again, carefree, full of something this house hadn't known in years: life. He stayed there a moment longer than he meant to, then shook his head. "She's just a pawn," he muttered, and disappeared upstairs. But fate doesn't always ask for permission. Clara's birthday arrived a day she hadn't mentioned to anyone. She had written it, quietly, in the corner of her journal. No celebration, just a small note to herself. That afternoon, Damien, while out buying flowers for a client, passed by a vendor selling fresh white roses. He stopped. He wasn't sure why, but he picked a bouquet, not thinking of Clara, not really. They just suited the house. That's all. Back at the mansion, he saw her outside watering the garden. Without a word, he placed the bouquet on the kitchen table. A single note rested beside it. "For you." When Clara came in and found the flowers, she froze. Then unexpectedly she laughed. A real belly laugh. "Well," she said aloud, amused and stunned, "didn't think that jerk knew where to buy flowers." She placed the roses in a vase and carried them into the garden, letting them join the chaos of petals and weeds she was slowly learning to love. She didn't thank him. But something inside her softened. Days later, at the hospital, she learned that Noah's surgery had gone ahead after all. The doctor said the charity's funding had been mysteriously reinstated. She didn't need to ask who was behind it. Another time, she dropped a glass in the kitchen. Before she could bend down to clean it, Damien appeared, crouched silently, and picked up the pieces without a word. Clara arched an eyebrow. Didn't think you'd lower yourself to picking up shards, she teased. He didn't reply. He simply turned and walked away. Their silences remained thick, their glances few. But in the stillness, something delicate began to stir. Neither of them would admit it. Not yet. But the seed had been planted. 3 months passed. The mansion no longer felt like a museum of cold rooms and unsaid things. It had changed not because of him, but because of her. Clara, with her defiant spirit and resilient warmth, had slowly coaxed life back into the hollow spaces. The kitchen carried the scent of baked bread. The garden bloomed with defiant wildflowers. Sometimes her songs could still be heard, floating through the quiet halls. Her marriage was still a cage, but she had made herself wings. Whether she'd been left on the street or placed in a mansion of marble and glass, Clara would have found a way to carry joy in her pocket. That was just who she was, someone who didn't wait for life to soften before deciding to smile. The change began, almost imperceptibly, in the kitchen. Clara never intended to cook for Damien. He didn't ask, and she didn't care to, but whenever there were leftovers, an extra serving of soup, a bit more rice than needed, she would leave a plate on the kitchen table. Might as well, she'd murmur, setting the dish down casually. No use letting it go cold. The first time, it was a simple plate of spaghetti-rich tomato sauce, cheese melted just right on top. Damien had returned late that evening, his shoulders stiff with fatigue. He paused when he saw the plate waiting silently under the warm light. He frowned, then sat, then ate wordlessly. He hadn't expected to enjoy it, but the flavors were warm, comforting, not elegant like a restaurant's dish. Better. When he finished, he rinsed the plate, dried it, and vanished upstairs. No thanks, no nod, nothing. But the next night, another plate appeared. Pumpkin soup with a swirl of cream, then potato pancakes, then roasted chicken, golden and sweet with honey glaze. She never said a word about it, never waited to see if he ate, just left it there, like a quiet habit she didn't need noticed. At first, Damien told himself it was simply practical. Leftovers, he muttered. No need to waste food. But soon, he found himself coming home earlier. Not every night, but often on the nights she cooked. Once, he arrived late to find no plate on the table. Clara hadn't cooked that evening. He lingered in the hallway, pacing near the kitchen, glancing at the counter, then finally retreated upstairs, annoyed at a hunger he couldn't name. Damien responded in his own way, quiet, clumsy, masked in excuses. One day he brought home a small bag of oranges and set it on the counter. Bought them for a client. Had extras. Clara glanced up, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "Your clients must really love citrus," she teased, taking one and tossing it lightly in her hand. Another time, it was a bouquet, white daisies, soft pink carnations. "Again for a client," he said, without looking at her. She didn't call him out, just arranged them in a vase, placed them in the garden, and whispered to herself, amused, "This guy really can't say what he means." Their words remained few, their gazes brief, but something was shifting, not loudly, not quickly, but enough to stir the stillness. The man who had once been nothing but cold obligation. The girl who had once been nothing but burden. Neither would admit it, but something soft was being planted in the quiet. That evening, a formal dinner party was hosted by one of Vale Corporation's major partners. Damien had to attend, and Walter made it clear Clara's presence was required. Appearances, after all. She was given an emerald green gown, a gift from Walter fitted to her form with almost regal precision. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she smirked, half sarcastic, half resigned. "All right then," she muttered. "Let's pretend it's just a free theater performance." When they entered the grand hall, lit with chandeliers and glittering with polished charm, Clara walked beside Damien. He said nothing, his expression unreadable. The room was filled with well-rehearsed laughter, champagne flutes, and the invisible weight of old money. Clara stayed near the buffet table, fingers wrapped around a glass of orange juice, eyes scanning the crowd. She didn't belong here, but she smiled anyway. At least the food's good, she whispered to herself. From a distance, she spotted Damien in a circle of men with silk ties and quiet power. They laughed easily, too easily. She watched him as if watching someone she didn't quite recognize. And maybe he didn't recognize himself either. Clara hadn't meant to overhear. She was simply passing through the edge of the ballroom, the breeze from an open window drifting in. Along with it came the unmistakable sound of Damien's voice, calm, careless. He stood with his back to her, a wine glass in hand. A tall man beside him, clearly drunk, laughter too loud, clapped him on the shoulder and slurred, "So, where's that wife of yours? The one you married to keep the old man happy? Heard it was all just a show." Damien smirked. That same cold curve of his mouth she'd come to recognize. He lifted his glass and replied, tone like glass against skin. "She actually thinks we're equals just because she's been living in my house a few weeks. A girl like her doesn't belong in my world. This whole thing is just a performance for my grandfather's sake." The words didn't just land, they cut. Clara stood rooted, her glass trembling in her hand. A few drops of juice splashed onto the marble floor. But it was the word lowly that echoed the loudest in her head, over and over. Lowly, not enough. A shadow playing pretend. She had cooked for him, smiled through silence, sang into rooms where no one listened. And all the while to him, she had been nothing but a convenient lie. Quietly, she set her glass down, her hands curled into fists, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. Then she turned and walked out fast, silent, unseen. Outside, the night was sharp and restless. Her thin dress clung to her skin as she stood beneath a towering oak tree, breath catching in the cold air. Tears slid down her cheeks, uninvited, unwelcome, but too strong to hold back. "I'm not something you throw away," she whispered to the wind. "I'm not a stain on your life," her voice cracked. But her pride, though bruised, rose like a shield. She had lived through worse. But somehow, this felt like the cruelest blow of all. Inside, Damien laughed along with his companions, unaware of what had just happened. When the evening came to a close, he looked for Clara, ready to leave. But she was gone. A staff member informed him she had stepped out long ago. He frowned, just slightly. A flicker of something he couldn't name brushed across his chest. Back at the mansion, the air felt heavier. The garden was dark still. No song drifted on the air. No warm light in the kitchen. He climbed to the second floor and knocked on her door. No answer. When he opened it, her room was dim, silent, empty except for her old canvas bag sitting neatly on the bed. She hadn't left the mansion, but she had left him. In the days that followed, Clara became a ghost within the house. She emerged only when she knew he wasn't there. The kitchen table stayed empty. The garden grew wild. Her voice no longer filled the halls. Damien tried to ignore it, told himself it didn't matter. But it did. The silence was louder than her laughter had ever been. And the absence of her cooking felt like a space in his life he didn't know had formed. One evening, he came home early, something he rarely did anymore, and saw her. She was in the garden, the first time in days. He stepped forward, his voice harsher than he intended. "What are you doing? Why have you been avoiding me like some child?" Clara turned slowly. Her eyes were red, but not weak. They blazed. She dropped the watering can with a dull thud on the ground. "Avoiding you?" she snapped. "After what you said at that party, you actually expect me to want to be near you?" Damien blinked. caught off guard. What party? What nonsense are you talking about? But Claire had already stepped closer, her finger jabbing into his chest. Don't you dare pretend I heard everything. How I'm beneath you, how this is just an act, how I don't belong in your world. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the ache of betrayal. Into your world. That's what you said, right? Clara's voice trembled, but her eyes didn't flinch. They were filled with something raw, wounded pride, betrayed trust, and a fire that refused to be smothered. You think I'm trash? She said, barely above a whisper. Something to mock in front of your friends? Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, let them speak for her. The hurt in her gaze was sharp enough to cut. Damien froze. He remembered the words. Of course he did, but instead of remorse, something darker rose in his chest. So what? He snapped. Who do you think you are to expect anything else from me? You're just part of a bargain. Don't forget that. Each word landed like a blow. Cruel, cold, deliberate. Clara's voice broke into a sob as she shouted, A deal? Then I'm done pretending. I'd rather sleep under a bridge than live in a cage with you. She turned and stormed inside, disappearing into the house. Damien stood alone in the garden. The air was thick. His fists clenched. Anger burned in his chest. But beneath it, something else stirred, something far harder to name. That night, rain fell in relentless waves against the windows of Vale Manor. Inside, silence reigned. But it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that presses on the ribs, makes it hard to breathe. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her old canvas bag, the one piece of her old life that still felt like hers. Her cheeks were stained from crying, but her expression was steady now, quiet, resolved. Damien's words echoed in her mind, one line louder than the rest. You're just part of a bargain. She had laughed through hardship before, found joy in places most people would have given up on. But this was different. This time, her dignity had been trampled. And some things, Clara had learned, weren't worth trading. Not even for love. Not even for survival. She reached for her journal, tore out a page. Her hand trembled as she wrote, I won't be a weight you have to carry. Goodbye. She folded the note, took a breath, zipped up her bag, and walked out into the storm. The darkness closed around her, but she didn't look back. Not once. At dawn, Damien returned. Tired from a night spent pacing his office, trying to bury the argument beneath paperwork and deadlines, he stepped into the house, expecting the familiar rhythm of Clara's quiet presence. But the kitchen was still, cold, lifeless. No smell of soup, no faint hum from the garden. Just silence. He frowned, walked to the kitchen. The table was clean, empty, as if no one had ever sat there. He climbed the stairs, 2 at a time, knocked on her door. Clara? He called out, his tone sharper than intended. No answer. He opened the door and stopped. The bed was neatly made, the wardrobe door ajar. Her things, gone. Only a small note remained on the nightstand. He picked it up, read the words once, then again. I won't be a weight you have to carry. Goodbye. The paper slipped from his fingers, and for the first time in his carefully controlled life, something inside Damien Vale cracked. He rushed to the garden. The wind had blown leaves across the path. The wildflowers she'd once nursed into bloom drooped from neglect. The daisies he had brought, telling himself they were just for a client, still stood. Wilted now, sad, mocking him. Back inside, he walked into the kitchen, where something caught his eye. Her apron, the one she wore with such quiet pride. Frayed, stained, singed at the edges from mornings spent over the stove. He picked it up and held it like something fragile, and as the scent of her cooking faded from the air, memory surged in to take its place, Laughter he hadn't appreciated, warmth he hadn't earned, a love he'd never asked for, but had somehow begun to need. He remembered her smile, bright and unguarded, as she sat in the garden, golden light dancing on her face, fingers brushing wildflower petals like they were sacred. He remembered her voice, clear and low, singing in the kitchen late at night, when the world was quiet and he'd lingered in the hallway without knowing why. He remembered the pumpkin soup, how he'd eaten it, begrudgingly at first, and then looked forward to it without ever saying a word. And the fruit, the flowers, the lies he told extras for a client just to leave something on the table, just to watch her eyes light up for a brief second as she teased him. At the time, he had convinced himself none of it mattered, but now, those moments pierced him like splinters under the skin. What have I done to her? The question echoed through the hollow of his mind. Damien sank into the sofa, still gripping the apron she used to wear, frayed and stained, but soft with memory. The house that once felt like a fortress now felt like a tomb. No scent of cooking, no humming from the garden, no fire in her voice when she threw sarcasm like sparks. He hadn't realized how much of her had seeped into this place until she vanished from it. He stepped onto the balcony, the cold wind lashing against his face, but it couldn't numb the ache in his chest. Those words from the party, now monstrous in their echo. A girl like her could never step into my world. How wrong he'd been. She was the only thing that had ever made his world worth stepping into. She didn't belong beneath him. She was the light that had stood beside him. Until he put it out. How could I be so blind, he thought, voice cracking silently inside him. How didn't I see it sooner? He collapsed back onto the sofa, head in his hands. He thought of that first day, coffee spilled, her hands shaking, her eyes defiant. He thought of how she married him for her brother's sake, not out of love, but strength. He thought of her, standing in the garden, shouting that she'd rather sleep on the streets than be near him. And he knew she wasn't weak. She was stronger than him, and he'd been too proud to see it. He fumbled for his phone, panic clawing at his chest, only to realize he didn't even have her number. He rushed upstairs, tore open drawers in her room, searching for anything, a clue, a note, a trail. There was nothing but a few scribbled recipe pages, corners curled, ink smudged. He picked one up. Her handwriting, neat but hurried. Pumpkin soup. A touch of cream makes it warmer. His vision blurred. He blinked hard, but the tears came anyway. For the first time since losing his parents as a boy, Damien Vale cried. Not for death, but for something living he had let slip away. The weight of it crushed the last wall inside him. He loved her. Not just now, in her absence, but from the very beginning, when she'd challenged him, ignored his coldness, brought color into his gray world. And now he had no idea where she was. Where did she go? Is she all right? The thought of her out there, alone, hurt in a way he couldn't quiet. He grabbed his keys, dashed into the rain without a coat, heart racing. The coffee shop, the hospital, anywhere she'd mentioned. He didn't have a plan. Just one certainty burning in his chest. I have to find her. I have to make this right. Her note lay on the passenger seat as he drove into the night, 5 words written in quiet heartbreak. I won't be your burden. Goodbye. And as the rain blurred the windshield and the road stretched endlessly ahead, Damien Vale chased not just the woman he'd lost, but the man he could still become, if she gave him the chance. Meanwhile, somewhere, on the quieter side of the city, Clara sat on the edge of a worn motel bed. The air was heavy with the scent of rain. Her canvas bag rested beside her, still packed, still ready. Outside the window, raindrops painted silver trails down the glass. She watched them in silence, her face still, her eyes no longer crying. She wasn't broken, not entirely. She had promised herself she'd keep living, as she always had quietly, fiercely on her own terms. But, deep within, the ache hadn't faded. It lingered like an old bruise, and she had no idea that the man who once wounded her was now out there, chasing her shadow through every rain-soaked street. The rain hadn't stopped for days. Damien Vale drove through the night, exhaustion pressing into his skin, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his thoughts tangled in a loop of what-ifs and too-lates. On the seat beside him, her farewell note lay crumpled, its simple words burning more than any accusation. I won't be your burden. Goodbye. He had searched everywhere, the hollow tree, the hospital, even the alleyways she once mentioned with a half-laugh and a memory in her eyes. Nothing, no trace. 3 days passed. No food, no rest. Just regret pounding through his veins, then, like a breath in the dark, he remembered something, a name, a place. The small town Clara once said she and Noah had grown up in. A place over 100 kilometers away, where life had been simpler and harder all at once. It was a fragile thread, but it was the only one he had left. He drove through the dawn mist and arrived just as the first light crept over the hills. A roadside diner sat quietly at the edge of town Mama's kitchen. A flickering sign, fog glass windows, warm light glowing inside. And there, moving between tables in a green apron, was Clara. She looked thinner, tired, but not defeated. She was still her, still strong. Damien's breath caught in his chest. He sat frozen in the car, watching her like someone afraid of waking from a dream. She had started over, and he had driven her away. He stepped out, his suit wrinkled from days of wear, hair unkempt, his face lined not with arrogance, but sorrow. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Clara turned, smile fading the moment her eyes met his. She stepped out from behind the counter, her voice, cold, clipped. What are you doing here? Damien didn't answer at first. He just looked at her. Then slowly, with all the weight of everything he had failed to say, he dropped to his knees on the old wooden floor. The diner fell silent. Only the hum of rain beyond the windows remained. I was wrong, he said, his voice rough. I don't deserve you, but I can't live without you. I'm sorry for everything I said, for everything I didn't say. I was cruel, I know that, but I need a chance, just one, to make it right. Clara stood still, her hands clenched by her sides. His words echoed, but couldn't touch the place inside her that had been shattered. A girl like her could never step into my world. She hadn't forgotten. She looked down at him not with hatred, not even with anger, just with quiet exhaustion. You were right, she whispered. We're from 2 different worlds. Go back to yours. I don't belong there. And with that, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. But Damien didn't leave. He knelt there for a few seconds more, letting her rejection settle like dust on his shoulders. Then he stood, eyes not softened, but sharpened with resolve. He'd wounded her beyond what words could mend, and maybe she would never forgive him. But love, he had finally learned, isn't claimed with apologies. It's earned in the days that follow. That night, Damien checked into a small roadside motel down the street. 1 room, no frills, just enough. He wasn't here to win her back with grand gestures. He was here to prove with actions, not promises, that the man who had once broken her heart was gone. And the man standing here now was someone willing to stay for as long as it took to rebuild what he had destroyed. The next morning, Clara returned to the diner, as usual, tired, focused, ready to survive the day. She wasn't expecting to find Damien there. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a plain shirt, sleeves rolled, and a look in his eyes that was neither arrogant nor apologetic. He stood behind the counter, already drying glasses, like he belonged there. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, her tone sharp, weary. "I told you to leave." His answer was calm, steady. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here whether you want me to be or not." She didn't respond, just turned away, assuming he'd last a day or two before vanishing again. But he didn't. He scrubbed dishes until his hands turned red from soap. He mopped floors, unloaded crates, learned how to slice tomatoes without ruining them. No complaints, no expectations. Life, however, had a way of adding complications just when the air was beginning to settle. That complication arrived in the form of Tom. A gentle, good-natured mechanic from the town, Tom had a smile that didn't ask for anything in return. Tall, with soft brown hair and kind eyes, he came to the diner often sometimes with a basket of apples from his garden, sometimes with a cake he baked himself. He didn't hide his affection for Clara. He spoke with warmth, offered to fix things, listened. One day, as he patched a leaky pipe near the back, he looked at her and said softly, "You don't have to go back to the city, Clara. You could start fresh here. I'd help you." Clara offered a faint smile. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. And in a way, that silence spoke volumes. Damien watched it all from a quiet distance. He saw how Tom made her laugh, how she leaned closer when he spoke, how she looked more at ease beside him than she ever had beside Damien. And for the first time, Damien Vale tasted a bitterness he wasn't familiar with. Not pride, not entitlement, fear of losing her, not to chance, but to a man who hadn't broken her heart. So Damien changed, not with speeches or flowers, but in smaller, slower ways. One rainy evening, Clara came down with a fever from overworking. Without a word, Damien stood in line at the pharmacy, soaked to the bone. He left the medicine at her doorstep with a simple note: "Take this. Don't burn yourself out." He didn't knock, didn't wait for thanks. Another day, she was struggling to bring life back to the garden behind the diner, a patch once loved by her mother. The next morning, she found a pile of tools and fresh seeds waiting for her, and Damien, kneeling in the soil, hands dirty, quietly digging without looking up. "What are you doing?" she asked, arms crossed. "I want to help, that's all," he replied. Clara said nothing, but she didn't send him away. She began to speak to him again, never long sentences, never soft. "You're peeling that wrong. Hold the pot with both hands. Don't forget to rinse the lettuce." And Damien never asked for more. Each clipped word was a victory. Each glance was a thread. Tom noticed. One afternoon, he stopped Damien outside the diner, eyes steady, voice firm. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Clara doesn't need someone who hurt her. She deserves better." Damien didn't argue. "I know I was wrong," he said, "but I'm not giving up. If she chooses you, I'll respect it. But I have to try. I have to make things right." Tom didn't answer. He didn't trust Damien, but he didn't press Clara either. He stayed by her side, his quiet presence pushing Damien to keep proving himself. Healing didn't come in a wave. It came in drops, like soft rain over soil that had once hardened with pain. One evening, long after the diner had closed, Clara stepped into the backyard. She found Damien sitting there, muddy hands resting on his knees, eyes gazing quietly at the flowers they'd planted together. She didn't speak at first, then slowly she walked over and sat beside him, not too close, not too far, just close enough for both to feel the silence this time, not heavy like before, but soft and full of possibility. They sat in the garden, side by side, the silence between them no longer sharp, but soft like the hush before something is said that might change everything. Clara spoke first, her voice quiet. "Why don't you leave?" She didn't look at him, just watched the flowers sway gently in the breeze. I told you already. I don't belong in your world. Damien turned toward her, his eyes more vulnerable than she'd ever seen. I used to think my world was everything, he said slowly, but I was wrong. He paused. My world means nothing without you. So I'm staying, whether you forgive me or not, because you're the world I want to belong to now. Clara didn't respond right away, but she didn't walk away either. She looked at him, really looked, and what she saw wasn't the man who once dismissed her as beneath him. It was someone stripped of pride, sincere, weathered, real. And for the first time, hope stirred in her chest. A small spark, faint but alive. I haven't forgiven you, she said, voice steady, but I'll see what you do next. It wasn't a promise, but to Damien, it was everything. In the days that followed, he stayed. He worked beside her at Mama's kitchen, sweeping floors, drying dishes, learning how to slice onions without crying and mop without missing corners. He no longer carried the name Damien Vale like a crown, but as a man rebuilding himself, one humble step at a time. Clara kept her distance, her gaze no longer cut, but it guarded. Still, she watched, and he never asked for more than she was willing to give. Tom, ever steady, remained a quiet presence, a reminder that love doesn't always arrive in storms, but sometimes in gentle, patient offers. But Damien didn't fear him anymore, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to win. He was trying to deserve. Weeks passed. Damien stayed, worked, waited. Clara's hometown was small, the kind where weather still ruled the rhythm of daily life. And one evening, as dark clouds gathered over the hills, a storm swept in, angrier than usual. Thunder cracked open the sky. Wind howled through narrow alleys. Rain battered the rooftops like a warning. Clara, as always, stayed late to help clean the diner. She was worn thin. Long hours, emotional strain, the quiet worry for her brother's recovery, everything weighed on her small frame. She carried a tray of dishes down the back stairs, steps slick with rain. Her foot slipped. There was a sharp cry, the sound of shattering glass, and then nothing. Mrs. Lilly found her collapsed at the foot of the stairs, blood seeping from a cut on her forehead, body motionless. Hands shaking, she called the only person who came to mind. Damien, it's Clara. She's hurt. Please come. Now. At his motel, Damien jolted upright, the phone trembling in his grip. He didn't wait for more. He tore into the storm without a coat, without thinking. The streets were flooded. Headlights barely pierced the sheets of rain, but he pressed the gas harder, heart thudding like thunder in his chest. I can't lose her. I can't. He skidded into the hospital's parking lot, stumbling through the doors, drenched and breathless. Clara lay on a bed in the emergency room, her head wrapped in white gauze, her skin pale, her body still. She's stable, the doctor said gently. A mild concussion, some blood loss. She'll be all right, with rest. Damien approached slowly, hands trembling as he reached for hers. It was cold, delicate, alive. He dropped to his knees, his voice barely a whisper, face buried near her side. I won't lose you again, he choked. I swear I won't. Behind him, the door opened. Tom had arrived. Mrs. Lilly had called him too. And there he stood, watching from the threshold, as the man who once hurt Clara now held her hand like it was the only thing that tethered him to life. But even then, Tom didn't speak, because in that moment, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not victory, not rivalry, but genuine regret, and a love trying painfully, slowly to make its way home. Mrs. Lilly arrived not long after. She stopped at the doorway, her eyes falling on Damien, who sat at Clara's bedside, her hand cradled gently in his. There was something in the way he held her quiet, desperate, human. Tom stood behind Lily, silent. His eyes darkened with a quiet storm of jealousy and worry. But he didn't enter. He turned and walked away, leaving Damien alone with her. That night, Damien never left Clara's room. He sat through the hours, wiping the fever from her brow with a damp cloth, changing her bandages, holding her hand through every small tremble. His suit, soaked from the storm, still clung to him. His eyes were hollow with exhaustion, but he stayed still, constant. When Clara stirred awake, the next morning, her vision blurry, she found him there. His face was pale, drawn, but he hadn't moved. "You," she whispered, her voice weak. "Why are you still here?" He didn't miss a beat. "Because I can't be anywhere else." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull her hand away either. She looked at him, this man who had once shattered her spirit, and saw someone else. No longer cold, no longer untouchable, just a man, stripped of pride, terrified of losing her. The pain hadn't vanished, but something had shifted. Clara wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but her silence no longer pushed him away. It held space for what might still come. Damien's true sacrifice came soon after. While Clara rested in the hospital, his assistant called with urgency. A massive international deal one he had chased for 6 months was ready for signing. "Mr. Vale," the voice pressed through the phone, "if you don't return today, they'll walk away." Damien glanced at Clara, still asleep under the soft hospital light, and without hesitation, he ended the call, then texted one line, "Cancel the meeting. I'm not coming back." He gave up the deal, the prestige. Everything his old self had once believed defined his worth, and he didn't even mention it to her. That afternoon, Clara woke to find him at her bedside again, holding a lukewarm coffee, eyes as tired as ever. "I heard you on the phone," she murmured. "You're not going back?" He met her gaze with quiet resolve. "The company doesn't matter. You do. I lost you once. I won't let that happen again." His voice wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And that, more than anything, shook her. She knew what a deal like that meant. To walk away from it was unthinkable. She looked at him, her voice still guarded. "Don't say things like that. I haven't forgotten what you did." But Damien didn't waver. "I know." After she was discharged, he stayed in town. He no longer tried to impress. He learned to be present, helpful, human. One day, as Clara made soup in the small kitchen of her temporary home, he stepped beside her, a knife in hand. "Teach me to peel potatoes," he said. Awkward but earnest, she gave him a side glance. "You? Cook?" "Good luck." But she guided his grip anyway, and even though he mangled the potato, she didn't take the knife away. That soup, strangely, tasted better than usual. Another afternoon, Damien returned to her garden, the one they once dug together in silence. This time, he brought daisy seeds, her favorite. Together, they planted in the fading sunlight, his hands muddy, shirt damp with sweat, but his smile, real, unpolished, unafraid. Clara sat beside him, watching in quiet wonder, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Why do you like planting flowers?" she asked. "Because you do," he answered, "and I want to see you smile again like you did back at the mansion." She didn't reply, but her expression softened, a little. Day by day, he continued. He brought her tea on long nights, fixed a window that rattled in the wind, learned to bake from Mrs. Lilly just to surprise her. One morning, he placed a blackened loaf on the table, sheepish and smudged with flour. "It's not as good as yours," he said, scratching his head. "But maybe try it?" Clara eyed the charred edges, then burst out laughing, her first real laugh in his presence. "You're hopeless," she said between giggles. But she took a bite anyway. She took a bite, then another. Her small, thoughtful movements, chewing slowly, without teasing, without mocking, made every burnt corner, every clumsy attempt at baking, feel worthwhile. Clara didn't say the bread was good. She didn't have to. Her silence wasn't distant this time, it was warm, a kind of quiet that let something new begin to bloom. She was softening, not all at once, and never with grand declarations, but in how she stayed, and how she looked at him longer, in how she no longer guarded her every breath around him. She saw him not the man he once was, but the one he was trying to become. Damien Vale was no longer the cold-hearted heir to a towering empire. He was just a man, one who had given up everything to be by her side. And yet, the fear still lived in her, tucked deep in the corners of her heart. One evening, as twilight kissed the garden where daisies began to bloom again, Clara turned to him and spoke softly. "I don't know if I can trust you again. You hurt me too much." Damien didn't flinch. He reached out, took her hand in his gently, like a question, and said, "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me now, but I'll wait." For as long as it takes, Tom remained in Clara's life, always kind, always near. He no longer glared at Damien or questioned his presence, but he watched quietly, protective, respectfully distant. One day, as they walked home from the diner, Tom asked her, "Do you still love him?" Clara didn't answer right away. Her eyes wandered to the garden, where Damien knelt beside a broken flower bed, replanting with care. "I don't know," she finally said, "but I'm starting to find out." Tom nodded, giving her a small smile, and he stepped back, not out of surrender, but respect. Because he, too, wanted her to choose from peace, not pressure. The space between Clara and Damien continued to close, but not through apologies or promises. Through presence. Through laughter that returned in fragments. Through tea quietly shared. Through the rebuilding of trust. Not by force, but by time. Every glance she gave him, every smile that flickered across her lips, it became a lifeline for Damien. A path out of the darkness he'd built with his own hands. And he followed it carefully, gratefully, because this time he wasn't chasing redemption. He was living it. Months passed. By now, Damien's presence in the small town had become part of the rhythm, steady, humble, real. Clara, once guarded by the memory of betrayal, now carried something else in her eyes. A quiet openness. A willingness to believe again. The love between them no longer lived in the past. It was being rewritten, slowly, sincerely. That opportunity came one evening, under the familiar chandeliers of the Grand Royal Hotel. Another charity gala, the same place where it had all begun: chaos, misunderstanding, the wrong ring, the wrong words. But this time, everything was different. There was no pressure, no forced appearances. Only a man and a woman walking in side by side, by choice. Clara wore a deep green dress, simple, elegant, one she had chosen herself. Damien walked beside her, his tailored suit sharp, but his hand warm in hers. The ballroom glittered. Laughter echoed through the hall, but Damien's eyes never left her, not once. He didn't need to impress the crowd. He needed only one person to hear him. When the host called Damien to the stage, inviting him once again to speak as the evening's sponsor, he stepped forward. But this time, he held no mask. He took the microphone, paused, and let the silence gather. Then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady but raw, "there was a time when I thought success was about control, about power, about winning." He glanced toward Clara, who stood near the edge of the room, glass of orange juice in hand, her expression unreadable. "I was wrong. I hurt someone I love, someone who brought light into a life I didn't realize was so dark." The room grew still. He smiled gently. "Clara, you are everything to me, not because of a name, not because of a deal, but because you saw me when I didn't deserve to be seen." He stepped down from the stage. The crowd whispered in hushed awe. Damien walked toward her, stopping just before her. Then slowly he knelt, not with a family heirloom, but with a simple silver ring he'd chosen himself, quiet, unadorned, sincere. This isn't for legacy. This is for us. Will you start over with me? Clara took a step forward. She looked down at the man kneeling before her, not the cold executive she once hated, but the man who had peeled potatoes, knelt beside flower beds, held her hand through fevered nights, and stood in the storm when she had fallen. He was different. He had changed, not by force, but by choice. And when he looked up, his voice trembling, holding out a simple silver ring, not the heirloom, not a symbol of family pride, but something chosen for her, her heart answered before her mind could hesitate. She set her glass down, and in front of 100 eyes, she knelt, two only enough to embrace him, arms wrapping around his shoulders, eyes wet with tears. Yes, she whispered, her voice cracking, I'll marry you, not for obligation, not for Ethan, but for love. The applause swelled, but neither of them heard it. In that moment, the noise fell away, and the world shrank to just the two of them, two hearts that had broken, healed, and found their way back. Damien held her tight. Overcome, thank you, he breathed, for giving me a chance to be better. And Clara, through tears and laughter, whispered back, don't waste it. They didn't rush into planning. There was no talk of designer gowns or gala receptions. A month later, they stood together in Clara's backyard, where daisies bloomed in the garden they'd planted side by side. It wasn't grand, it wasn't showy, but it was theirs. Close friends gathered Mrs. Lily, wiping her eyes as she ladled soup, Tom standing with quiet grace and bittersweet acceptance. And even Walter Vale, seated proudly in a wooden chair near the back, a cane resting at his side. The ceremony was simple, the food was homemade, the love undeniable. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Walter stood slowly and smiled. I always knew she was the one, he said. You just needed time to catch up. Damien bowed to him. A gesture not of submission, but gratitude, then turned and squeezed Clara's hand as anchor, his home. After the wedding, they returned to the city together, but not to resume the lives they'd once had, to build something new. Clara kept working at the hollow tree. She refused to give it up. Damien didn't ask her to. Instead, he visited often sometimes just to bring her coffee, sometimes just to see her smile. He handled Ethan's treatment personally, connecting the best specialists through Vale Corporation. And one day, after months of careful care, Ethan walked out of the hospital, stronger than ever, his laughter echoing in their home like sunlight. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was real. Damien still ran a company, but he came home in time for dinner. He read to Ethan when Clara had late shifts. He brewed coffee each morning, not because he had to, but because she once did it for him. And in the evenings, when the world quieted, they returned to the garden planting, laughing, slowly rebuilding. One evening, Clara watched Damien chase a laughing Ethan through the flowers. She sat on the steps, hand resting on her stomach, heart full with a new, quiet secret, yet to be told. Damien looked up, met her gaze, and walked over. He took her hand gently. You're everything I didn't know I needed, he said. She leaned into him, eyes soft. And you're becoming everything I hoped you could be. They stood like that, bathed in golden light, the wind brushing through petals, the past behind them, and something even greater still ahead. Time moved gently. The seasons changed, but in their little world of warm tea, wildflowers, and whispered promises, Clara and Damien found something they'd never had before, peace. Not the kind that arrives with grand endings or perfect lives, but the kind that grows in quiet gardens, in shared glances, in the arms of someone who once hurt you, but chose to heal you, too. Their love was never flawless. It was rebuilt, forged in apology, woven with forgiveness, strengthened by the ordinary, and perhaps that's what made it extraordinary. One evening, as the sky blushed with twilight, they sat on the garden bench with little Liam asleep in Clara's arms. Ethan was nearby, strumming an old guitar softly. Damien reached for Clara's hand, fingers now so familiar, so real. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice a soft breath. Do you think this is what happiness feels like? He didn't answer right away, just looked around the child in her arms, the brother's quiet melody, the flowers they'd planted blooming again and nodded. I think it's what we made happiness feel like. And in that moment, they both understood. Love doesn't always begin in fireworks. Sometimes it begins in silence, but when it's true, it stays, it heals, and it stays. Thank you so much for joining us through this tender and emotional journey here on Soul Stories. If this story touched your heart even just a little, please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe, like we do, that true love can overcome time, pain, and pride, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. To never miss another heartfelt story, subscribe to our channel and help us continue spreading warmth, empathy, and hope one story at a time. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.